The topic of sabr, okay, which is a well-known thing, but I think sometimes there are some misunderstandings in our community about the concept, the nature of sabr, what it actually means and what it doesn't mean as well. And of course it's especially relevant, I mean it's a very relevant thing at all times, but especially relevant of course for what we've been experiencing in these, we might call them these COVID days. Because we're told, for instance in the Quran, we're told that bir, righteousness or piety, is not the turning of your heads or your faces in the direction of the east or the west. Yes, it's not just going through the motions. Yes, righteousness is just not, yes, I've mentioned this before, we've looked at this before, that it's just not going through the motions. And then, in that verse, and then there's a long list of what actually does constitute bir, righteousness or piety. Lots of things, and I won't go into that now, but including things to do with articles of faith, practices, and so on. But towards the end of that verse, what's mentioned, and the patient, this is one of those categories of what constitutes bir, righteousness, that the patient, those who are patient in misfortune and hardship, and at times of peril or danger. So you can see how this may be especially relevant now. But as I say, it's an incredibly important area of our deen. We know this, yes? But it's fundamentally important. One reason is, for instance, we have in Surah Al-Asr, mentioned this before as well, of course, by time, verily man is in a state of loss. That's our default state. And then there's 4 exceptions mentioned. Except for those who have faith and do good deeds and urge one another to the truth and urge one another to as-sabr, to patience. So you can see how important it is. And in fact, at the end of Surah Al-Imran, the very last verse, what's mentioned, so, O you who believe, be patient. Yes, but also, and vie with one another, compete with one another in patience. Stressing the fundamental importance of this. But as I said, there are some misunderstandings, even including us using the word patience for sabr. That is part of sabr, but really the English word patience is not sufficient. It doesn't cover the widespread meaning of sabr. So we might use other words like perseverance, or patient perseverance. Yes, this is sabr, hanging on in there, steadfastness, consistent or constancy, to maintain something. Restraint, it also includes restraint. That is also sabr in certain situations. And so it's a much more widespread meaning than the word patience, because in English patience has certain connotations, which really it doesn't cover the meaning of sabr. So for instance, most of us understand that we have to have patience, or we're encouraged to have patience in terms of trials, tests, tribulations, yes? We understand about sabr in terms of calamities and disasters. But do we understand that patience, for instance, maintaining the obligations we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that requires sabr. That's covered by sabr. That's the quality we need to be able to pray 5 times a day. It's not an easy thing for some. It requires sabr. And also to stay away from things which are prohibited, forbidden, and to avoid temptations. That also requires sabr. So much more widespread meaning. Also, one thing that patience isn't, sabr isn't, but in English the word patient implies it, is a sort of passive acceptance. That's not sabr. Not just passively accepting something. And I'll give you a couple of examples, personal examples of this. Many years ago, I was in a queue. I think it was at the Saudi embassy for I think it was a visa for either Umrah or Hajj. Yes, this many years ago I was talking, and I was in the queue waiting patiently, and people were pushing in. you see. Now, I started to feel annoyed about this, yes, and I noticed there was a number of people just pushing in or going to the front. Now, of course, we know that in some ways we're in a unique culture in this country where we believe in queues. A lot of people around the world don't actually believe in queues. But nevertheless, this was in the UK. And I was much younger then, I was getting angry about this because, you know, I was waiting and waiting and people pushing and pushing. And then finally someone pushed in directly in front of me and I said something. And I said it angrily. I said something like, I can't remember the details, but something along the lines of, why can't you wait till the queue like the rest of us? Or, you know, what makes you think you can just push in front? Now, it's possible that these were travel agents and so on, and maybe they had that right, I don't know. But the thing is that the brother who, he was affected by my speaking to him, what he said to me, and this really amazed me at the time, he said, have sabr, brother. Now, I thought at the time, this is so cheeky. This is just so, yes? He's the one who's pushing in. Yes, I'm protesting, and maybe I shouldn't have raised my voice or whatever, but then he's complaining, and he's telling me to have sabr. So we can't use sabr as an excuse for bad behavior. Yes, now that was in some ways a comical or slightly funny example, but a serious example. Many years ago, again, in a different masjid, I remember an imam saying in a gathering, just a sort of gathering, some sort of circle, and he was praising a sister that he knew, a woman, Muslim woman that he knew, whose husband was violent, okay? And what he was saying is, oh, mashallah, this woman, she has so much patience. You know, he's doing this and he's doing that, and she doesn't call the police, she's being patient. Now again, I was quite struck by this, I was quite shocked, and I spoke to him afterwards, really. I said, you know, what is this? Because I've come across this sort of example subsequently in our community. Look, sabr, it's not a virtue to be a patient victim, a passive victim. We shouldn't be praising this behavior. You know, really, if that imam, he knew that this was going on, the obligation was for him to do something about it. You know, not to expect this poor woman to be just putting up with violence. Now this is something we've got to be clear about. You know, we're not, in Islam we don't have a victim mentality, we're not victims. Whatever the situation is, a situation like that, really we need to take action. We know the hadith that if you see a munkar, an evil, then stop it with your hand. Yes, i.e. take action. If we're in a position to take action, I need to make this clear. We don't go around just applying this without thought. Yes, and we don't do this if it creates greater trouble than the benefits. You see, it's more subtle. But anyway, if we see a munkar, we're supposed to stop it with action. Yes. If we can't do that, hadith goes on. If you can't do that, then stop it with your mouth or your tongue. With our speech, so we can speak out against it. And if you can't do that, stop it with your heart. It means a sort of, don't accept this wrongdoing. At least hate it, the wrongdoing. And the Prophet went on to say, and that is the weakest form of faith, that last bit, you see. So we should be people who actually speak out against dhulm, against oppression or injustice or wrongdoing. It's not a virtue to be patient about it in a passively accepting way. Yes, for our men or for our sisters. As we take action. And one of the situations I've seen this in, or heard about, many times, yes, we've heard this, and I come across it in my work, is as a psychotherapist. When there are families where there's an elder, supposedly respectable member of the family, and he is committing, or maybe sometimes she is committing some sort of abuse, whether it's physical, verbal, sexual. There's all sorts of abuses that people can perpetrate. Now, what happens in some of those families, and I've come across a number of times over the years, people don't say anything. You see, they don't say anything because it's their grandfather, or maybe it's their own parents. And there's this idea that we have to be respectful. Now, yes, we have to honor the elders, but not when they're doing something dishonorable. We don't honor abuse. You see, that's not a situation where we say, oh, we're all being patient. No, we take action. That's necessary. Or speak out at least. Speak out against it or hate it in our hearts. See, sometimes we mistake expression of feeling for a lack of sabr. You know, people, and again, it's only in some sectors of our community, but we have the idea that if someone is expressing grief, for instance, that's a sign of not having sabr, you know. And people very too quickly say things like, have sabr, brother, have sabr, sister. Now, this is a correct teaching in terms of we should be recommending to each other to have sabr, but we also need to have some understanding of the context, some empathy. You know, to say to someone, you know, be patient or have sabr after we've heard their story, actually heard what they're going through, and I may be empathizing with what they're going through, and then saying it. That's very different from this sort of immediate response that some people give. Just have sabr. And also some people ask, how do you just have sabr? And we'll look at this next time, inshallah. But it is, you know, the Prophet ﷺ, he wept when he was burying his son Ibrahim, his young son. He wept, he was crying. Now the Prophet ﷺ, it wasn't a lack of sabr, or a lack of iman, or a lack of understanding of qadr. It was an expression of emotion. Maryam alayhi salam, when she was giving birth, and she was about to give birth to Isa alayhi salam, what does she say? It says in the Quran, قالت يا ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت ناسيا منسيا. She says, would that I had died before this and been a thing forgotten, utterly forgotten. Those are strong words. But it's not a lack of sabr or iman or shukr, gratitude. Yes, it's an expression of pain. She was in extreme pain, both from the physical aspect of the childbirth, but also from the way that her community might behave towards her. You see, so we need to look at these examples and think. Yaqub alayhi salam, he was so in grief about Yusuf alayhi salam that his eyes went white. Some say that he went blind. You see, that's not a lack of sabr. In fact, he says, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ, a beautiful patience. So, yeah, we need to understand these subtleties and these nuances, you see. We don't want it to be all black and white, because then we might make mistakes.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Hope this video was helpful for you. This may help others too, so please consider sharing. And we will bring more videos in the future, inshallah. So consider subscribing and you won't miss any. Jazakallahu khairan.